and thank you for all the participants who've been with us so far this morning, afternoon, or evening, as well as those who are just joining us now. This is a webinar on digital storytelling in the Global South, utilizing spatial archives for diverse audiences. We are about to begin our third and last session topic of the day on digital storytelling and the narrating voice, and engaging more deeply with how marginalized voices and perspectives can be integrated into the digital storytelling process. So how we can empower communities to engage with storytelling in ways that could be sort of self-directed or generative, or just being mindful of colonial contexts in ways in which we can deepen connections between communities and their cultural heritage. As with our previous two sessions, please feel free to put questions in the chat as we go along here. This webinar is being recorded and will be available, as well as additional resources contributed by our panelists after the webinar session. The first panelist that I would like to introduce is Daniela Gachago from the Center for Innovation and Learning Technologies at the University of Cape Town.
Hi, can I share my screen? Can you see my presentation?
Yes, it's perfect. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for giving me an opportunity to share some of my practice at this panel. It's been very interesting, although I must say I'm slightly out of my depth. My practice is very different. I'm in an academic staff development role, so we work with lecturers across the university to support them in introducing innovation in their teaching and learning. And digital storytelling was one of those projects that became quite successful. At my previous institution, I also worked at CPUT, like Siddiq, who was part of the first panel, and also now at UCT. So I'm going to talk about voice and marginalized voices and giving space, but also the ethical issues that come up when working with vulnerable students in the space of higher education. So I don't know, I think there are so many definitions of digital storytelling that I've come across even just in this panel. So when we talk about digital storytelling, we refer to the work of the Story Center, Joe Lambert and colleagues. So we see digital storytelling as a collective exercise where you create digital stories in the space of a workshop, or maybe over a period of hours across some weeks, but you develop stories together. And it's quite a process. You develop first an oral story in a story circle, so that collective telling of the collective telling of stories becomes really important. So it's not so much about the technology, but more about the telling of stories within a specific context, often in relation to a specific topic that students or participants are passionate about. So it came very much from the community space, this model, but it has entered higher education as an alternative way of assessing students, as an alternative to writing essays, speaking to digital literacy skills. It has found its way across all disciplines and faculties. And it's about personal reflection and growth, and often around digital literacies and different forms of expressing themselves. And yeah, more creative forms, maybe more familiar to students, more close to their vernacular, or their, as they, people call them vernacular skills. So closer to where students' cultures are. You can use multilingual and bring in students different languages. So it's a very nice way of bringing students' voices into the classroom in various forms. But it's also become now a really often used participatory research methodology. It's often in the public health field, but also in education and across various disciplines. And also for community engagement projects, like Siddiq's work is very much within the community engagement space. So what we found, what really works well when you bring digital storytelling into the curriculum, is the integration of the curriculum content and the personal experiences. So it's a way of bringing students' personal experiences, their community into the classroom, into the conversation in the classroom. My own practice. So I started using digital storytelling about 12 years ago as part of my PhD in the Faculty of Education. And it was used for in teacher education, the final year project, reflecting on becoming teachers, influences on their teacher identity. But really what it became was a facilitation of difficult conversation in the classroom. It was nothing that we had set out to do. My initial idea was actually to do it as a digital literacy project and in combination with teacher reflection. But what it became was really conversation. It was a tool to encourage students to talk about race, gender, class. So as I called it as a post-conflict pedagogy in classrooms that are usually not students who are usually not necessarily that integrated in their social lives, but they find it themselves in this integrated classroom. It's a tool to create space for conversations across difference that are usually not held. So this is one of my student stories. So we often work with disciplinary experts. Like in this case, we worked with in journalism in a political reporting class, and the students had to reflect on their identity and how their identity would impact on becoming journalists. If they go out and interview communities, how does their positionality matter in that space? So this is one story, and I'll see, can you, or I will have to share again, I think, and share my sound. Apologies. Stop sharing, share with sound, share. Can you hear the sound?
What
A bit
am
low.
I ask myself, do I deserve to be treated this way? Why can't I walk down the street without hearing men catcall, whistle, strip me with their eyes, follow me, grab me? I must cover myself, look like them so I don't draw any attention. I'm told to be careful, be observant. You are a lady, and the world is not a safe place for you. What am I? I am a woman. I am not an object. I don't deserve to be treated this way. I want to walk down the street without being afraid of who could grab me and do things that I have nightmares about, or see headlines about young girl raped. So listen, we are the bodies that feed you in the womb. We are the bodies that birth you and protect you. So don't invade me. Don't treat me like a sexual object. Do not objectify my body. And don't touch me like that. I deserve respect. I deserve for you to not want to harm me, because I am a person too. I am a woman. I am your mother, your grandmother, your auntie, and your sister. I am a woman.
So this was one example from our students. And I think you can see the power of these stories to start conversations. And this is not even that personal. We have far more personal stories that our students tell. But they choose a topic, and in this case, they had to choose one identity element, whether it's race, class, gender. She chose gender, but that then led to really interesting conversation in the classroom, and very much about this idea of, the danger of the single story, and just hearing many stories about one topic and seeing the different perspectives in class. So, in terms of the topic of the panel, I mean, these kind of stories, this kind of tools or pedagogical approaches allow certain topics into the classroom that would usually maybe not be as easily, or it's never easy, but it would not find space. And because it comes from a personal experience, in some ways people are more open to share and to talk to each other about this really often quite contentious and difficult subjects. But the longer we did this, although this project really got a lot of like positive support and feedback, and we got lots of like interest across many different disciplines and faculties, the more we did this, the more we grappled with ethical issues, because these stories are often so contentious and personal, and students don't always think about what they're sharing. And these are digital stories, so they live, they live somewhere, even if it's just in the memory when we screen them in the classroom. So there are there's a lot of work around the ethics of digital storytelling, but they're often developed for very specific practices, like the Story Center. There are a lot of assumptions that they make in how these digital storytelling practices play out. So it's small workshops, it's highly facilitated, they're getting all the support needed, it's on a voluntary basis, it's around specific topics. People have equal access to technology, they get a lot of support. There is a right to choose, a right to withdraw. There's this ongoing consent that is being negotiated. Participants can leave at any point. And there's also a very clear expectation, a demarcated timeline for the relationship between the storyteller and the facilitator. Now, if you translate that into higher education, where we talk about assessed projects, huge classes, much more diverse, like digital literacy skills and access to technology, and also the lecturers not being able to provide the kind of support that maybe the Story Center would. Questions of ownership and consent and control, and who assesses, what do you assess? Do you assess the process of the product? There were so many ethical issues that came up. Over time, we got actually more and more uncomfortable doing this kind of work, although it was such a powerful tool. But it also, the more we did it, the more it raised really thorny ethical questions. And there's a lot of literature around the ethical dilemmas and ethical issues when working with digital stories and vulnerable students, and especially when using it also then for research. So I was part of Untold, that was an unconferences. I know I'm nearly done. And the thing that I think what we came up with is that, or what it became so clear, that each content needs their own ethical guidelines, that we can't just adopt the guidelines from the Story Center, because their approach is very different and their purpose is very different. So we got together and created these guidelines for ethical practice of digital storytelling specifically within higher education for teaching, learning, research, and community engagement. And it was interesting because it was much less, it became a list of questions rather than, and examples of what people did, rather than, clear guidelines, or this is how you have to do it, because it is so contextual, and it always, it's an ongoing conversation between you and your students and your department and the community to negotiate and renegotiate these ethical guidelines. And I've got the link to the document if anybody's interested. I think the time is up.
Thank you very much, Daniela. And, I think the variety of perspectives here from different disciplines are wonderful, both in terms of assumptions that we take for granted, but also when we put on our disciplinary, lenses, and we don't think about both sort of the variety of, ethical resonances, challenges that resonate, but also things that we haven't even considered. That can inform our own practice. I'll also point out that we have 10 different disciplines represented here, which I think is, quite good for digital humanities as well. Anthropology, visual arts, geography, information science, computer science, archaeology, museums, adult education, history, nonprofit organizations, and engineering education. It's a mouthful. So thank you again. And with that, I would like to switch to history and introduce our next panelist, Noor Netagodin from the University of Witwatersrand.
Thanks very much, Carla. Hope you can hear me. And I'm asking because there have been times when the kind of reception was interrupted. So I hope it's not on my side. I should say, just to preface my comments, that I found the last few sessions and the last speaker's contribution very useful and insightful, and I've learned a lot. And perhaps a bit like her, I feel like a kind of 18th century Luddite in this audience. Nonetheless, I'll make some comments. I thought that what I should do is just to kind of reflect on how digital technologies can both augment and facilitate the kind of work that we're doing. But I want to conclude by saying that as much as it facilitates our work, it in fact reproduces some of the inequities and potentially puts up new barriers, particularly to the democratizing dimensions of the work that we're undertaking. So what are we doing? And let me just start at the beginning for a second. I'm from the history workshop in the Faculty of Humanities here at British University. And we've been around since 1977 as part of a kind of process of the overhauling reconfiguration of South African historiography that picked up speed from the 1970s. Largely located in social history, public history, and in particular oral history. And an important dimension of this work has been, since the outset, the use of oral history as a critical methodology to undertake the work of producing new histories. And there's no time to go into the details, but let me kind of summarize by saying that an important aspect of that has been the uncovering of histories of marginalized groups, the subaltern, and in the case of South Africa, the Black majority, which had until then largely been erased by the kind of dominant white society in the production of histories. And a lot of the work that had been undertaken from the 1970s to the present has been marked by trying to uncover those different histories in which oral histories and oral testimonies have been absolutely critical. And of course, until, in fact, quite recently, and I would say maybe the late 1990s, early 2000s, a lot of that work was analog. And so there's a significant archive that exists of old tapes in various formats of those histories, and they're really critical archives, which go back to kind of recording histories of the early 20th century, but in fact also of the 19th century. Since then, I would say that an important part of how new technology and particularly the possibility of digitization has assisted has been in the creation of enormous new archives. And so the first point I want to make in terms of how the technology has contributed to the work that we do, and it's about, to summarize, uncovering hidden histories, creating archives, and then very importantly, in relation to public history, participating in creating partnerships with various communities to co-produce histories of those communities and the various associations, organizations that I have created. And so digitization has by and large contributed, particularly over the last 20 years, to the creation of an enormous oral archive, a digitized oral archive. And just to give you kind of two examples, from the early 1990s, when the liberation organizations were unbanned, and many people returned from exile, people were kind of freed from prison, there were multiple projects, some of them supported by the democratic government, to record the histories of many, many people, hundreds, if not thousands of people. And, you know, the history workshop contributed to this. So one has scattered across the country, particularly at universities, but also other institutions like Freedom Park, District 6 Museum, and elsewhere. Really treasure troves of archives that run into thousands and thousands of hours. In the history workshop itself, just over the last 10 years, we've undertaken research across the northern parts of our country, and we've probably interviewed about 2,000 people. Sometimes those interviews running into 5, 10, 15 hours. So what I'm trying to convey is that an important part of the digitization process has been to contribute to the creation of the significant archive. One has also seen at universities a process of attempting, in varying degrees of success, of digitizing existing archives, paper archives, analog interviews. And that process is continuing apace. But I would say that they are probably most successful at a handful of universities and less successful at public archives, where there are, for different reasons, various degrees of crises that have prevented the archives from operating optimally. So in terms of an important aspect of oral history and producing new histories, which has been about the democratizing of the production of knowledge, I would say that the creation of these digital archives has been a fundamental contribution. I do, though, want to kind of turn to the other side of this equation, which is about the co-production of knowledge with communities. For example, you know, we're involved in multiple projects, but I only want to reference one project, a fairly recently established project, which we have named the Soweto History and Archives Project. And the intention there is to build on a long-standing initiative of interviewing as many people as possible across sectors, not only political, but involving artists, poets, etc., educators, and the like, in order to create a new archive that will principally be an oral archive, but also archives of communities. Now, we are quite likely to be fairly successful in creating this digital archive. But what I want to emphasize here is that public history and the kind of work that we have been involved in is defined by the kind of concept of co-creation of historical knowledge. And that requires fundamentally overcoming the divide between universities, the ivory towers of universities, and the communities in which we work. Typically, universities refer to this as community engagement or as outreach. In my mind, those are kind of neoliberal, managerialist kind of terms, which don't really convey what it is that we try to do, which is in a sense to create spaces in which dialogues can be produced, in which knowledge is created with people on a continuous basis, and principally to try and create that knowledge where people are. Now, what that means is that the kinds of technologies that are available at universities need to become available in those communities. Now, to some extent, of course, those technologies are available, depending on the kinds of devices that people have. So at our university, and the students that, who work with us, many postgraduate students, they are certainly able to install various kinds of digital platforms that allow us not only to make access to the archives possible, but also to produce the kinds of histories and make those histories accessible to broader communities. What I'm pointing to is that that is one part of the process. The ability to create conditions in which digital technology can be utilized by those communities in order to participate reasonably equally, not only to access and consume histories that have been produced in the academy, but also use those technologies to participate in in recreating, co-creating, and producing their own histories on their own terms, in fact, is far more difficult than one can imagine. Let me conclude by making two or three points. The first is, it is typically when I make this point to different audiences, and recently I made these points at the conference of the International Federation for Public History. And many people kind of responded with varying degrees of incredulity, because it's an assumption that technologies are widely available and people have devices, for example, cell phones, to be able to access various kinds of technologies. And theoretically speaking, this is entirely true. Right? And it is certainly true at a university like the one that I'm at, University of the Witwatersrand. But in the communities around us, and particularly in those communities where we work, it is far more difficult for those technologies to be used with the kinds of devices that people have access to. So it makes it incredibly difficult to meaningfully use the technologies at hand that I have access to and my students have access to use those in the kinds of ways that we're hoping we can in the areas where we're working. We are, for example, working in 1 or 2 museums in Soweto, and these museums are supported by the state and particularly the local government. But even these institutions that have resources, in fact, don't have, for example, stable internet, right? So the possibility even of people going in the community, going to a museum to be able to use those resources, that kind of technology is quite limited. So let me then conclude simply by saying that digital technology holds enormous possibility to facilitate the kind of co-creation of historical knowledge that I have been kind of alluding to, and that is at the essence of what we do. So we do talk about decolonizing the production of knowledge, and we have been able, by and large, to overcome the physical barrier between the university and the poor communities in which we work, by in fact working in those communities and working in those communities rather than inviting them to our spaces where knowledge is produced. Digital technology allows one to create the possibility of facilitating that kind of co-creation of knowledge. But in fact, digital technology also creates new barriers that prevents and makes it more difficult often to create spaces of this co-production of knowledge. My final point is this is kind of referencing the International Federation for Public History. It is very significant that in that federation that has grown exponentially over the last 10 years, there's only one African representative of a university on this public history, and that is at Wits University. And I would suggest that one of the reasons is that the kind of technologies that we celebrate correctly, that can facilitate the creation of public history, in fact, is not being rolled out in the same kind of way that they are in the global north, and should be, in order to allow the kind of public history that we do to spread across the continent. Thank you.
Perfect. And thank you very much, Noor, for your perspectives and insight as well. Last but absolutely not least is our final panelist of the morning, afternoon, or evening. This is it's my pleasure to introduce Mutano Ganya from African Digital Heritage.
Give me a minute to share my screen. I hope you can see my screen. I'll try and minimize this. Is it clear?
Yes, Mutano.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone, for sticking around and for sticking to the cause. I'll try and make this as fast but informative as possible, because Noor highlighted most of the points that I needed to highlight, and there's so many synergies into our work. So my name is Mutanu, and I work at African Digital Heritage. And when we're talking about digital storytelling and why we do it, we love to say that we straddle between technology and culture and history and storytelling. So we say that we help people connect the past with the present and in turn shape the futures. I'll try and spotlight how we do this during our talk. But above all, one of the many reasons why we do this is we want to add the voices of our people to our historical archives and collections. Considering our Kenyan history, what we have in our archives and collections was really from a white lens and a colonial point of view. But also, if you know the Kenyan history, you know that most of our collections were destroyed just so this things that happened during our fight for independence will not be passed down generations and people won't be able to talk about it. So again, one of the reasons why we do this is to be able to raise awareness of marginalized and contested histories through co-creation. I'll give an example of Mau Mau detention camps. So the Mau Mau are what we call freedom fighters in Kenya. And during the 1950s, during our struggle for independence, members of the Mau Mau, or rather, most of the Kenyans were held in reserves, and then the Mau Mau went to the forest to try and fight. So during this night, in the period of 1950, there was a state of emergency that was declared. It was one of the bloodiest periods in Kenyan history. However, unfortunately, not many people know about exactly what happened during this time. And I want to try and paint a picture about the situation right now. So 1950s is like 2 generations down from me, which means my grandmother went through this. And my parents, okay, they were born, but I don't think they had enough knowledge about what was going on. So yes, it's closer home than we think it is. But considering the tactics that the perpetrators used to ensure that the politics of memory, or rather this documentation of this memory isn't passed down generation, was really superb. when you think about it, they did a really good job. So in order to be able to unearth these stories and these histories, as African Digital Heritage, you took on these projects, and as Angie had said, the first thing that we did was we tried to structure the narrative, and we first mapped the detention camps wherever they are. And we figured out that most of the detention camps, the current detention camps, are actually schools. So in trying to make sure that people forgot, the place that represented torture now represented what in the 1960s and 1970s, the early independence years of Kenya looked like the framework for for development. So in order to get this histories well, because they do not exist in our national archives, we got the information, the primary sources of information from 3 places. So we did site visits, then we had oral history interviews, and then we looked at archival records, which weren't a lot. And I'll give you an example of one of the camps. So it's called the Agudhie camp. This is one of the photos that we found. It was taken by JM Karaoke, who was a Mau Mau detainee. And we are not really sure when the photo was taken. But when you look, we wanted to, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but yeah. On this is the tower that we wanted to reconstruct, and I'll tell you why. So, and on the tower, it says Muitethia Nia, which basically translates to, if you want to be helped, you have to help yourself. Crazy. So this is another photo we got, but this is a screenshot from a video that was taken from a British Pass video in 1959 of the same camp, and then this is the same entrance. And so during our field trip, we went to the present-day Agudhie camp. This is how it looks like in 2018. Of course, the tower did not exist, but as you can see, the entrance is the same. The entrance is the same. And yeah, sorry, this, you can see that the entrance is kind of the same. So so we were able to reconstruct, as I said, we were able to construct this tower using the photos that we got and oral history. One of the things, as I had mentioned before, is that you see these buildings here. This is currently a secondary school in Kenya, and most of the students who go to this school don't even know that it was a detention camp. And that, yeah, and that this part here used to be trenches. On the link, I will share a video to, sorry, on the chat, I will share a video to this 3D simulation that we, sorry, I'll share it later. Yeah, I'll share the 3D simulation, a link to the 3D simulation later after the chat, but you can go through it and just go and see how we were able to do the reconstruction for these towers. So now we have finished digitization, and one of the many things that, as Noor mentioned, one of the many things that we are cognizant about is we do not want to replicate the structural inequities that come with digitization. So we make sure that we take whatever it is that we have digitized to our audiences wherever they are. And because we are a digital organization, one of the many places that we have used very well is social media. And then what does that look like? And what does now co-creation and co-production with our audiences on social media look like? So as I had mentioned before, the Mau Mau story is very abstracted from the nationalist story, and it lacks the human experience version of it. So what we did is we went on our Twitter and we shared our story, and we said, this is where we were doing this, these are the gaps that we got. One of the things that we saw is that we don't have many collections or many stories to identify the stories from. And what we got was overwhelming response on people. Some even shared emails with photos of their grandparents' journals on the experiences that they had in these camps. We had people sharing photos just to improve our archives, and yeah, stuff like that. And maybe something else that I need to mention about our work is that we want to make it reusable as possible and to be able and to be open to our audiences as possible. So we usually make it like an open data set, and it's under the open attribution licensing, open use open attribution licensing. So scholars, majorly anyone is open to reuse it as long as they attribute African digital heritage. Another way that we were able to, something else that we have been able to figure out in this process is that in as much as we are going on to social media to our primary audiences who are, again, gifted enough to have access to smartphones and internet and electricity all the time, is that most of the people who lived through the Mau Mau era do not have access to these spaces. So we rely on our primary audience to go and sit down with our secondary audiences. These are the Kenyans who lived through the Mau Mau era, to just sit down with them and have a chat and have a talk on a history that is very fundamental to Kenya, but has rarely been talked about. And yes, and we are trying to see where this goes, and just trying to build a community archive out of it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matano, as well as to all our panelists for sharing your expertise. I am completely floored with not just the breadth of knowledge represented here, but again, I can't think of any space except for a digital space where we can have so many different experts from different parts of the world represented here in the same place, where the ability to communicate and share this knowledge again across our disciplines, because we read very narrowly, or we share based on our networks. And I'm hoping in turn that all the participants and panelists here see this as new connections to take forward. This is a final reminder that the webinar is being recorded. And after the webinar, we will be following up with a recording of the webinar, as well as resources that our panelists have put together about their work and other training and research opportunities. Stefania, I'm going to turn it over to you for the final Q&A, if that's all right.
Thank you. We have immediately a question for Glenn for Mutano. Do you want to ask your question, Glenn?
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation, Mutano. I just wanted to ask, as one of the few Africa-based initiatives to digitize heritage, what was your view? What is your experience, or how has that been for you? And also, just to follow on that, if, how you view the balance of power when sometimes co-creation is done between global North and global South countries. That's a lot, but thank you.
I'll start with the first question. Thank you so much for asking it. I want to say that I love it because not many people are doing it and will see the possibility of it being a success. But we have been able to get in rooms that we never dreamed of, because as most of the panelists spoke about today, they are cognizant about telling the story of the global South, and yet they're not indigenous of the space. So it is nice to at least have people who have lived through this, or who relate to this or affected them directly in terms of family, to be able to sit there and share their stories. It comes with a lot of authenticity, but it also helps you in connecting with communities and in sharing communities, and also just sitting there with like the old grandmas and telling them thank you. Yeah. The second part is the balance of power and co-creation is done between global North and global South communities. Of course, there is a cognizance, or there's a in like the balance of power, but we're always open to learning, because as again, history, the galleries, libraries, archives, and museums were not, I want to say that this space was not built for the African audience. So it's nice to have Africans get into it and explore it and own it. As you know, as Africans, we used to tell our stories through storytelling, and that was it. We sit around a fire and we tell the stories. So to be able to be included in the space and see what practice looks like, and then own it the African way and see what you can integrate from our cultures has been really amazing for me.
Thank you. I do actually have a question for Mutano. I think African Heritage Project is one of those very unique and unfortunately very lonely projects that are run entirely by Africans in Africa. And I would like to just spend a few words sharing with our public how has this been able to be a success story. I am always amazed at how you're continuously able to raise your own funding and to keep going. And I think it'll be interesting, I think, for everybody in the public to know how you made it a success story, which is continuing despite all odds.
So you want me to tell the story of how we made it a success story? Wow, that's a nice question and an important one, but I'm trying to. So maybe just to mention that it has been a work of passion and sacrifice at the start. But we are seeing the fruits of it. We are seeing that more and more people are open to sharing, more and more people are open to the idea of digitizing of African heritage, and they're seeing the importance of doing it. We are also seeing that being young and female and Black, and just being able to sit here has also has also helped young girls and young people to just look at it from another angle, look at heritage from another angle, not just from, sorry to say this, not just from like a boring lesson that you have to take in school, but something that they can interact with and something that informs who they are and their futures. Yeah, I don't know if I answered your question well, but yeah, we are still learning from the people who've been in the space for a long time. Thank you so much for the organizers for putting this platform, this event together. I was able to learn a lot. I took so many notes. Thank you. And I hope that, yeah, as we continue to tell our story, we'll also continue to influence more Africans to join this space and influence them to own their stories and their narratives and put them out there for the world to see and be able to redocument our histories as Africans ourselves.
Thank you. I don't see other questions from the chat, but please, we still have a few minutes before we come to a conclusion. We have a lot of thanks coming through. Okay, let me continue and roll it. I have actually a question for Noah. You made some points that I think call for reflection. You know, I wonder myself sometimes, and I wonder what your take on this or other panelists would be, whether by using these digital spaces that do actually become frozen, especially in time, we are not killing basically those experiences of co-creating at a particular moment in time with a very contextual set of circumstances that happen when that sharing happens, and whether there is anything that we can do about it at all.
Yeah, thanks, Stefania. Look, I think that we have to recognize that there are various challenges and structural inequalities. But certainly we shouldn't allow those to paralyze us in kind of engaging the work. I think that one of the issues that we're confronted with is that digital technology kind of grows exponentially, and the reality is that many people who are poor and who are under-resourced are simply unable to keep up with the technologies. But there are moments when people kind of skip over stages of technological revolutions and play catch up quite quickly. And when that happens, I think we need to be attentive to the possibilities of then utilizing those technologies to greater effect than we can under normal conditions. So in a sense, what I think that should allow us to do is to kind of think, laterally, to use a kind of a cliche. And the approach that I take really is to be led by young people and students, so that the kind of challenges that you're referring to, don't become, stumbling blocks in the way that we undertake the work. So it is true that in different contexts, it is very difficult sometimes to kind of proceed beyond a certain mode of engagement. People are suspicious of technology, making things accessible to anyone because it's on a website or on one or other platform, in fact, often produces anxieties that people have, and anxieties about sharing their stories because they don't know, whether those stories are going to be spread on the World Wide Web and therefore be accessible to anyone, anywhere in the world. So, for us, recording stories, for example, about torture, about people's, traumatic experiences, and the ethical questions related to that are not resolved by technology and about access. They may allow us to preserve those material for posterity, but there are all sorts of other questions that remain unresolvable by technology, because technology facilitates, but don't necessarily answer the ethical questions that we are confronted with, in the course of our work. Thanks.
Thank you, Noah. We have another question from Funmilayo. Do you want to ask your question?
Hello, good evening, everyone. I'm so happy to be part of this program, although I am still in my undergraduate years, but a finalist. But I've followed through the trend of this program. My question is it possible for us to have a digital story for human paleoecology? Human paleoecology deals with the past. So how then do we reconstruct or create a story and digitalize it? That's my question. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't know which ones of our panelists would be able to address this, because that's actually a period that we haven't really covered through our panelists. But Mandy, you are the ones that came closer to more remote periods in time.
Hi, yes, I think that human paleoecology, I don't think would be that difficult. I mean, again, it would be reconstructing from your animals in the past. It would reconstructing environments. And in fact, we've done quite a bit with Sterkfontein, for example, reconstructing what that environment would have looked like with the short neck giraffes and the dwarf elephants, and then of course the hominins that were alongside with them. So it's quite a rich period, and you can take it back and you can take it forward and you can take extinctions out. I think there's quite a bit you could do there. You've caught me a little bit unawares and unprepared, but certainly we've done a lot with recreating those environments and then allowing people also to recreate for themselves. So giving them bones, giving them skeletons and saying, what do you think this creature looked like? This has been done with dinosaurs very effectively, putting across the notion that, look, there's only so much we can know, but in actual fact, if we give you this much, you can then assemble as much as possible, and then letting them create their own dinosaurs, their own textures, their own skin, and explain it and why. So I think there's quite a bit that can be done, and digitally, I think even more effectively.
And I would approach it from a data standpoint of what data do you have and how can you represent this in story form of, what information do you have about the bones? Do you have images? Do you have 3D data? Do you have maps, and context? Because all of those elements can be used to your advantage when you're trying to, tell the story about, where this is from and why it's important. So I think that's something that's important that comes out of all the threads here today is it doesn't matter what time of history it is, or what your discipline is. We're dealing with similar structural projects of archives or data sets and how to take them from sort of to many of our developed for research contexts. And how do you move those to storytelling in sort of informative content and explorative ways? With that, I think myself and Stefania would like to thank this set of panelists and all our panelists here today for such a robust and compelling discussion and presentation of your research. This has just been extraordinary. I'd also like to thank our presenters as well, our participants as well, from joining us around the globe, from staying here, from staying caffeinated as needed, and participating as part of this conversation, which again, I don't know where or when this would be able to happen otherwise. I feel very honored to be here, and I would like to thank our sponsors, the National Endowment for Humanities and AHRC, that made our project and therefore this webinar happen. We will once again follow up with links to the recording of the webinar, as well as additional resources that our panelists are putting together about their work and beyond. Stefania, do you have any final remarks? And I would like to also once again thank, and I haven't in a while, thank our wonderful facilitator and moderator, Rosie Campbell, as well, who has been behind the scenes, making sure everybody is here and attended to, and that nothing has broken, which is an extraordinary feat. Stefania, do you have any last remarks? And thank you all for your time today.
Just a round of thank you to everybody, our panelists, the participants. I am not sure you are able to see the poll. Having two screens doesn't help me, but we will share the poll as well with our follow-up resources so that you can all see where we were from, where we were based, and how we got here. Thank you. The 3 hours flew, at least for me. But let me allow you to get back to your day if you're based in the US, and go and have your well-deserved supper if you are in South Africa or Africa in general, and even to the east of that. Fantastic experience. Thank you so much for making it happen, and for all be so good. We didn't have any issues, and it proceeded very well. And see you next time.